Hi there everybody, welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be showing one of the easiest carpentry tricks in the book, and that is making a cutting board. Now before we begin, you should know that this is a 2-day process. It's gonna take 2 days, no bones about it. Doesn't matter how fast you work. If you're only making one, it's gonna take you 2 days to complete this process, just because you're gonna have what's called a glue up, which means you're gonna take pieces, you're gonna glue and clamp them together, and you gotta sit and wait for that glue to dry. And you have to wait for it to completely dry. So earlier today, I took a trip up to the Hobby Hardwood of Alabama. They just happen to live like a good 30-minute drive away. So I went to go see Robert and Martha, the wonderful owners. If you happen to live in North Alabama or Southern Tennessee, you should go check them out. They're great. So I went up there earlier today and got some nice little pieces. This is some Peruvian walnut that I got. Got a couple of slabs of that. And back here, I got some good old American maple right here. From North Alabama. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these pieces and we're going to cut them down to size. I'm actually going to think a little bit ahead, and I'm going to make them to the same bed size as my laser engraver so that I can go back and laser engrave these later. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of these pieces, specifically the maple pieces, and I'm going to cut them down to 12.5 inches. Now, the reason I do 12.5 is because the bed of my laser engraver is 13 inches wide, and once I get down to 12.5 and route it and get it ready to actually go on the laser engraver, it's going to need to be 12 inches wide so that I have a place to secure this piece of wood to the bed of the laser engraver. So all that being said, cutting our pieces down to 12 inches on the table saw. Once I've got that, I'm actually going to lay these out kind of the way I want them to. I want to make sure that the grain looks good and do simple things like that. And once I kind of know how I want them laid out, I'm going to joint the edges. So what this does is this makes the edges perfectly flat so that when they come together, there's no gap, there's no seam, there's no like rough edges between them. They're seamless or nearly seamless. That's the idea. And with this specific cutting board that I'm going to be making today, I'm going to do 2 pieces of maple and then 1 strip of the Peruvian walnut, and then I'm going to do a final piece of maple to finish out the board. And that's just going to give it some interest. That's just a style and totally a choice that anyone can just make out of creative desire. The only thing I wouldn't recommend is trying to use a stain to get the same look. So if you need a darker wood or a darker piece, don't try to get a piece of maple and stain it. Stain doesn't really work well with foodstuffs, and so I would try to keep stain or any sort of non-friendly finish away from the wood itself. So once we've got our pieces cut, we've got them figured out, we've got them jointed, now we're going to put them together. Now this is really the bulk of the work here, is getting your pieces back to the way you wanted them, so how you laid them out before you jointed them. You're going to lay them out, you're going to glue them, you're going to spread that glue so that it's covering all of that edge that you want to glue together, and then you're going to press the pieces together and clamp them down. Now the biggest mistake here is clamping them so tight that the pieces become bowed when they're together. Now this can also be caused by improper joining or edging, and so what we want to do is, if we get that effect, the first thing we want to do is relieve the stress, and if we see that there are cracks in the joints between the pieces of wood, like they've split a little bit, we want to re-joint them. So we're going to have to go back through the joiner, make sure that it is perfectly square, and then run our pieces right through the joiner. So once we've got that, we've got them together, we've got them glued, we're going to just sit. So once the pieces are dry, it is now day 2 in our process, so we wait an entire 24 hours for these things to dry and cure and be ready to mess with. And this is kind of where the finesse of the cutting board comes from, is we need to sand this thing down so that it is smooth as heck, and then we're going to route edges. We can also route other things. We can do handles, we can do juice grooves, we can also add feet to this if we really want to, but for this one, to keep it simple, following the KISS rule, we're just going to route the edges so that they are rounded and smooth. So we're going to use a roundover bit on our routing table, and we're going to take our piece all glued up and ready to go, and we're going to send it through the table saw to make sure that all of our edges are flat, and then we're going to send it through the router to make sure that all of our edges are rounded over and smooth. Once we've got all that taken care of, they're rounded, they're smooth, they're perfect. At this point, you would do your juice grooves, you'd do your handles, whatever you wanted to do. You got all that done. Now we're going to sand the actual surface. Now, in this particular case, it doesn't really matter which side is the top and which side is the bottom. If you do feet, sometimes if you do handles, it does matter which is the top. Definitely if you do juice grooves, it matters which is the top and which is the bottom. But for the sake of simplicity, we're going to do both sides, and we're going to finish them both exactly the same. So we're going to start off with kind of a coarse grit sandpaper. We've got an orbital sander here, and we're going to put a 80 grit sandpaper, so what we're going to start with, on the sander and go over it first against the grain and then finishing with the grain. Now with each step, we're going to sand this a couple of times, and each time we're going to start against the grain and we're going to finish with the grain. That's how we want to do this, against and then with the grain. Now between each sanding, we want to wet the board. Now what this does, by spraying just a little bit of water, the actual grain of the wood will kind of stand up just a little bit. And you'll notice this if you run your hand over the board, just after sanding it, it'll be really smooth, but then you get it wet and wipe it off, and it's rough again. And what we want to do is get it wet so that the edges or the grain stands up a little bit, and then sand that down. So what we'll do is we'll spray a little water on it, let it dry completely, and then give it a little sand. Again, we're going to do the 80 grit. We're going to do that twice. Then we're going to move up. We're going to go to, I'm going to go straight to 220 grit. We're going to do that twice, and then we're going to go up to 330 grit. I'm going to do that once, and then once we've done all of that, we're going to take an extra step to make this thing extra smooth. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and at this point put on a little bit of board oil. Now, you can make your own. There's plenty of recipes online for making your own board oil. I just bought this at Home Depot because it was easy. I'm just here to make a cutting board, not necessarily the oil. We'll make that some other day. So I'm going to put a generous amount of board oil on this board, and I'm going to rub it around. We're going to get it around, let it kind of soak in a little bit, get it around the edges, get it on the end grain. That's really important. The end grain is going to take the oil differently than the top, but making sure that every square inch and every square fraction of an inch gets the oil on the board. Once we've done that, we're going to kind of rub it in just a little bit. If we have any loose spots, if we have any pools anywhere, we're going to rub it in, get it on the end grain again, making sure that the whole board is covered in oil. Once we've got that and we've let it dry to the touch, we're going to go over this board with 1500 grit. Now that is some fine grit stuff, but that is going to make this cutting board absolutely smooth as heck. So we are going to hand sand with 1500 grit, starting just like we did with the orbital sander, going against the grain first and then later with the grain. Once we've sanded it with the 1500 grit, we're going to reapply just a little bit of board oil more. We're going to really press it in, making sure that every square fraction of an inch has gotten just a little bit more oil. We're going to let it dry to the touch again, and then we're going to sand it with that 1500 again. And we're going to do that whole process one more time, so a total of 3 times. Board oil, 1500, a little bit more board oil, oh my gosh, that's a tongue twister, 1500 grit, board oil, 1500 grit. Once we've done that, we're going to take just a tiny, and I mean the tiniest bit of board oil more. We're actually not going to put it directly on the board. We're going to put it on a cloth rag, and we're just going to wipe the board down, just like that. And once we've done that, we want to do it on the back first, and then on the top. If you do the top first, just put a rag down underneath this whole process so that you don't scratch your working surface while you're doing the backside. Once you've done all of that, it should look like this. And this is your gorgeous finished product cutting board. You are ready to take this into the kitchen. It is ready to go out and make some amazing meals. All right, so that's it. Here we've got our totally finished, sanded and oiled up, and laser engraved cutting board. And if I can do it, you can do it too. See you next time.